At the core, this is a revenge and redemption story deeply rooted in social injustice and systemic racism. The narrative focuses on the imbalance of power within the judicial system, the dehumanization faced by marginalized communities, and the eventual divine or poetic justice that unfolds when one abuses that power. It reveals how arrogance and prejudice can blind even the most powerful individuals. But the arc of karma bends back, sometimes harshly and often unexpectedly. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about the collapse of false superiority, the resilience of the human spirit, and the undeniable truth that justice always finds a way, even when the system fails. This story belongs to the drama genre, with strong undertones of social commentary, courtroom tension, and a psychological unraveling of a character. It also carries elements of suspense and thriller, especially as the antagonist starts losing control over the narrative he once manipulated. The dominant emotion of the story is righteous anger and revenge. However, it also invites the audience into moments of hope, indignation, and finally satisfaction when karma delivers its blow. There's a rising sense of tension and injustice, but it is balanced with the emotional triumph of poetic justice being served, not by the court, but by the universe itself. The title is intentionally provocative and emotionally charged. It sets the tone for a powerfully emotional story by putting two clashing elements side by side, a racist authority figure and the inevitable cosmic justice that humbles him. The title draws readers in with curiosity. Who was denied justice? What did the judge do? How did karma strike? It promises confrontation, emotion, and moral reckoning. The story aims to grip the audience with the reality that justice, when corrupted by hate, may escape the courtroom, but it cannot escape universal law. What happens when the one who sits on the bench, believing himself to be godlike in power, is humbled in front of the world by the very man he looked down on? This story is for every person who has ever been told they don't belong. It's for those who've been dismissed, silenced, or made invisible. And it's a sharp reminder for those who misuse power that karma listens and karma remembers. The courtroom was silent. The air, thick with anticipation, vibrated with an undercurrent of unease. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge, the man who had the power to change the course of a life with a single decision. His gavel was raised, but the room didn't need the sound. The weight of his stare, cold and dismissive, was enough. Guilty. The word hit the black man standing before him like a physical blow. His heart skipped a beat. But this wasn't just any case. This wasn't just any trial. And this wasn't just any judge. This was Judge Roy Mitchell, a man notorious for his biases, his arrogance, and his contempt for those he deemed beneath him. The courtroom gasped collectively, the collective outrage almost palpable, but none dared to speak out. The judge's smirk spread across his face like a predator savoring a kill, his eyes scanning the defendant as though he were nothing more than a speck of dust on his polished desk. The defendant, a young black man named Marcus, stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, fighting the overwhelming wave of emotions crashing over him. He had been accused of a crime he did not commit, but the judge had already made up his mind. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing mattered. This was a trial of prejudice, and Marcus was already guilty in the eyes of the law. But there was something Marcus didn't know yet, something Judge Mitchell had no way of anticipating. The universe had a way of balancing the scales when they tipped too far in the wrong direction. As the judge prepared to hand down his sentence, his gavel came crashing down in slow motion. But in that moment, a shiver of cold dread ran down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. And for the first time in years, Roy Mitchell wasn't so sure of himself anymore. This was only the beginning. Marcus James wasn't born into privilege, nor was he ever handed an easy life. At 28, he had already seen more of the world's cruelty than most people do in a lifetime. His skin, the color of night, had always been a target, a canvas for the prejudices of those who never bothered to see beyond it. Growing up in a neighborhood that was as tough as the city streets he walked, Marcus had learned early on that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about staying true to yourself when the world tried to break you. And, most of all, it was about perseverance. In a world that told him to stay in his lane, Marcus had always dreamed of breaking out, of being something greater than the stereotypes that were forced upon him. He was smart, He'd always been sharp, quick-witted, and determined. But none of that seemed to matter when the color of his skin spoke louder than his accomplishments. He had earned his degree in law from a reputable university, worked tirelessly for his place in the legal world, but the doors always felt just a little too narrow to walk through, the opportunities just a little too few. Yet, despite everything stacked against him, Marcus never wavered. He knew that, one day, his chance would come. It had to. And today, it was supposed to be his. This case, the one he'd been fighting for months, was his chance to prove not only to the world, but to himself, that his dreams were achievable. It was a chance to show that no matter how heavy the burden of injustice was, it could be carried. It was supposed to be his moment to shine. But then, Judge Roy Mitchell had entered the room. Marcus's first memory of Judge Mitchell wasn't a pleasant one. It had been during an internship at the courthouse, years ago, when Marcus had watched the judge rip apart the defense of a black man accused of a crime he couldn't possibly have committed. The words the judge spoke, the disdain in his voice, echoed in Marcus's mind long after the trial ended. There was no pretense of fairness in Mitchell's eyes, only a cruel, calculated indifference. Marcus had sworn to never allow such a man to hold power over him. And now, here he was, facing that same judge in the very courtroom he had hoped to see as a platform for justice. Instead, it felt like a trap set by a man who saw him as nothing more than a second-class citizen, undeserving of the same rights as others. But as the judge's gavel crashed down, Marcus's mind was already in motion. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, pushed to the brink, forced to fight for his place in a world that didn't always welcome him. And now, in this moment, he wasn't about to let a racist judge define his future. Not without a fight. Marcus's anger was not just personal, it was collective. He had seen the systems that failed his community for years, seen the way the world allowed some to rise, while others were crushed underfoot. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or ignored. But what could he do against a man with so much power? A judge who had all but sealed his fate? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But deep inside, Marcus knew something the judge did not. Karma was watching. And she had a way of balancing the scales when they tipped too far. Marcus took a breath, his gaze never leaving the judge. It was a look that spoke volumes, of defiance, of determination, and above all, of quiet strength. It was the kind of case that was meant to make history. The kind of case that could shift the power dynamics of an entire city. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the grand implications when he first walked into that courtroom. He was thinking about his client, a young black man wrongfully accused of assaulting a white woman, whose accusations seemed to crumble under even the smallest scrutiny. Yet, the courtroom felt like a stage for something much darker than the truth. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus's heart raced as he prepared for the final moments of the trial. His client, Trey, was a good kid, no record, no history of violence. He didn't deserve to be here, but the evidence was stacked against him. Not that it mattered. He glanced over at the judge's bench, where Judge Roy Mitchell sat, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on the proceedings with the kind of smugness Marcus had seen before. The day had been going well, or at least as well as could be expected. The defense had made their case, the witnesses had testified, and the evidence, though circumstantial, was enough to raise doubts about Trey's guilt. The jury seemed to be paying attention. For once, it felt like the law was actually considering justice. Marcus allowed himself a brief, fragile moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was it. This was the moment he'd worked so hard for. Then, the moment came when everything shifted, unexpected, jarring, and brutal. The prosecution's final argument was weak, nothing more than an attempt to play on the jury's fears and biases. But it wasn't the prosecutor whom Marcus needed to worry about. It was Judge Mitchell. Without warning, the judge raised his gavel. The courtroom went silent, every person in the room holding their breath, waiting for his ruling. But Marcus felt an unsettling chill crawl up his spine. Something was wrong. Something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the way Mitchell's eyes gleamed with satisfaction sent a shiver through him. The defendant is guilty. The words echoed in Marcus's head, growing louder with each repetition. His heart dropped into his stomach. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. He looked at Trey, his eyes wide, pleading, but all Marcus could do was shake his head, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't justice. Marcus immediately stood, stepping forward. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind raced. The words he'd prepared for this moment, suddenly feeling inadequate, impotent against the sheer weight of injustice unfolding in front of him. He had expected the battle to be hard. He had even braced himself for the possibility of a biased judgment. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. A wave of anger surged through him, threatening to consume him whole. But this wasn't just anger, it was rage. He wasn't just angry at Judge Mitchell. He wasn't just angry at the system that allowed this to happen. He was angry at the world that had let men like Judge Mitchell continue to wield so much power unchecked. And in that fury, Marcus felt something else. A shift, a calling. He had fought for so long to change the system, to fight back against every insult, every injustice. But now, it wasn't just about law or logic. It was about survival. It was about survival, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed, overlooked, or crushed by this very system. It was time for action, not words. But Marcus had no idea how far the consequences of this moment would go. As Mitchell's gavel came down, sealing Trey's fate, something else was happening. Something bigger. The world outside the courthouse had already begun to change. Karma was coming for Judge Mitchell. The universe had a way of making things right when the scales of justice tipped too far to one side. Marcus just didn't know that this case, this day, would be the trigger. As the doors to the courtroom opened, the sound of distant sirens echoed down the hall. And in that moment, Marcus knew he was no longer just fighting for a case. He was fighting for everything. Marcus stepped out of the courtroom, his mind in a blur. The weight of the judge's decision settled on his shoulders like a 1,000-pound boulder. He could still hear the words in his head, "The defendant is guilty." They rang through his ears, louder with each passing second, a constant reminder that in that moment, justice had been denied, and the system had failed. Trey was led away by the bailiff, his face a mixture of disbelief and defeat. Marcus wanted to do something, say something, but what could he say? The verdict was final. The system was rigged, and in the end, it was the lives of people like Trey that always got caught in the crossfire. He had fought for this moment for months. Countless hours spent preparing, countless sleepless nights. And now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. But deep down, Marcus knew he couldn't stop here. Not now. Not when so many people had already suffered under the weight of men like Judge Mitchell. As he walked down the long corridor of the courthouse, he felt an unfamiliar pressure building inside him, the kind that only came when something inside you was about to break free. He reached the elevator, his hand hovering over the button. The familiar weight of exhaustion threatened to take him under, but he forced himself to stay focused. Trey had just been sentenced to a prison he didn't deserve, but this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration startling him. He pulled it out, expecting another call from his firm, but instead, it was a text from his mother. The message was short, but it hit him like a gut punch. Don't let them break you. Don't give up. His mother had always been the rock of his life, the one person who had never doubted him, even when the world had. The words felt like a lifeline in the chaos, but also a painful reminder of what he was fighting for. He couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not when so many depended on him. Not when so much was on the line. The elevator doors opened, and Marcus stepped inside, his mind racing. As the elevator ascended, his thoughts turned to the bigger picture. He wasn't just fighting for Trey. He wasn't just fighting for one case, one man, one moment in time. This was bigger. The world was watching, and Marcus knew it. The legal system was corrupt, but it wasn't just the law that was broken. It was everything. The media, the education system, the economy. All of it was built on the backs of people who didn't matter. People like Trey. People like him. The moment he had just witnessed in that courtroom wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue. And Marcus was determined to be the one to expose it. But the journey wouldn't be easy. Not by any means. As the elevator reached the ground floor, Marcus stepped out into the lobby, the world outside looking as cold and indifferent as ever. He could feel it then, the eyes of everyone around him. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope. But symbols, he knew, were dangerous. They could either change the world or get crushed underfoot. He stepped outside, the weight of his decision heavier than ever. He couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not when the world needed him more than ever. He needed a plan. He needed to act fast. He needed to expose Judge Mitchell for the corrupt racist he was, and he needed to do it before this case buried Trey's life forever. As Marcus reached his car, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an anonymous number. The text was simple. "We know what happened. We can help. Meet us tonight. Midnight. The old warehouse on 5th. He stared at the message, his mind racing. Who could it be? Was it a trick? Or was it someone who knew more about Mitchell than he had? But Marcus had no time to question it. This was it. The opening he had been waiting for. If this was his chance to make the system see the truth, he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. He could already feel it, the beginning of something much bigger than he had anticipated. The battle wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was a fight for survival. It was a fight for truth. And as Marcus started his car, the engine roaring to life, he knew one thing. Karma had begun its work. The pieces were in motion, and there was no turning back now. The drive to the old warehouse felt like an eternity. The city lights blurred through the windshield, but Marcus wasn't really seeing them. His mind was elsewhere, spinning with every possible scenario. Who had sent him the message? What could they possibly know about Judge Mitchell that he didn't? What were the stakes now? He felt like a man standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing that one wrong step could send him falling forever. As he pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, he spotted the warehouse in the distance. The building was worn down, its walls cracked and stained from years of neglect. It looked abandoned, just like the people who used it. But Marcus wasn't here for nostalgia. He was here for answers. He stepped out of his car, his feet crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the entrance. The cold night air bit at his skin, but the urgency inside him kept him moving. There was no turning back. Not now. Inside the warehouse, shadows danced against the walls, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the empty space. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. His footsteps seemed louder with every step. He glanced around, his senses on high alert. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. The silhouette was tall, its features obscured by the low light, but Marcus didn't need to see the face. He knew this was the person he had come for. The message was clear. They had answers. The figure stepped into the light, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It was Detective Harper, the same detective who had been investigating the judge for months. The one who had almost vanished off the face of the earth after being pulled from the case. The one who Marcus thought was just another pawn in the corrupt system. But here she was, alive, well, and standing before him. "You've been wondering who we are," Harper said, her voice steady. But there was something in her eyes that betrayed her calm exterior. "Well, now you know." Marcus's mind raced. "You were the one who sent the message." Harper nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't have a choice. Mitchell's influence runs deep. I couldn't get the evidence I needed through legal channels. But I've been watching you, Marcus. You've been digging around in places you shouldn't. That's why I reached out." Marcus stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the break he had been waiting for. But something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Harper's demeanor was too calm, too rehearsed. It was almost as if she were playing a part in a larger game, one that Marcus didn't fully understand yet. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Why all the secrecy?" Harper's eyes flickered for a brief moment before she answered. "Because Mitchell is more than just a corrupt judge. He's part of something much bigger. And you're not the only one who's been targeted." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of her words settled over him like a dark cloud. "A conspiracy." Harper stepped forward, handing Marcus a folder. "This is everything I've gathered. Mitchell isn't just taking bribes. He's been covering up a lot more than you realize. But it goes deeper. He's involved with people who have the power to control not just the law, but everything. Media, politicians, even the police." Marcus took the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. The contents were shocking: documents detailing bribes, hidden connections to organized crime, and evidence of Judge Mitchell's ties to several high-ranking officials. But it wasn't just about money. It was about control, power, and something even more sinister. As he scanned through the files, one particular document caught his eye. It was a letter from Mitchell himself, with a list of names. People who were under his thumb. People Marcus never thought he'd see on the same page, his own colleagues. This is insane, Marcus muttered, his eyes widening as he read the letter. How is this even possible? Harper's face darkened. That's why I've been working in the shadows. It's the only way to stay alive. The system doesn't just protect men like Mitchell, it defends them. And if we don't do something now, the whole system will keep protecting him. Marcus felt his heart race. He had thought the fight was just about winning one case, but now he realized that this battle wasn't just about Trey. It was about something much larger. This wasn't just a court case. It was a war against a system so deeply entrenched in corruption that it could destroy anyone who dared to expose it. He looked at Harper, his mind spinning with possibilities. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But it also felt like the beginning of something that could destroy everything he had ever worked for. Before Marcus could speak, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the warehouse. His instincts kicked in. They weren't alone. Harper grabbed his arm. It's them. They're coming for us. Before Marcus could react, shadows moved toward them. Figures emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden behind masks. There was no time to think. No time to plan. They had been set up. The sound of footsteps was growing louder. This wasn't just about Judge Mitchell anymore. This was a war that had just begun, and Marcus had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. The footsteps grew louder, and Marcus's heart thundered in his chest. The figures in the shadows were closing in, and every muscle in his body screamed for action. His eyes darted from Harper to the approaching threat, trying to gauge the situation. But there was no time. No plan he could come up with would save them now. The warehouse suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. His hands clenched around the folder, his mind racing. He had known there would be consequences, but this was beyond anything he had ever prepared for. Harper's grip on his arm tightened. Marcus, we need to leave, now. But it was too late. The masked figures were nearly upon them. They moved swiftly, surrounding them from all sides. One of the figures stepped forward, a tall, imposing figure whose voice carried a chilling authority. You've dug too deep, Marcus. You shouldn't have come here. The figure's voice was cold, devoid of emotion, like a warning. Now, you have to pay the price. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He tried to back away, but the shadows pressed in closer, and there was nowhere to run. Harper stepped forward, her face resolute, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. This is it, she whispered, her voice tight. They found us. Marcus's mind spun. There was no easy way out of this. They could kill him, just as they had killed so many others who had gotten too close. Or they could silence him in a way that would make him wish for death. But then he remembered the folder in his hand. The evidence. It could destroy everything Mitchell had built. It was the only leverage they had left. Harper seemed to understand his thoughts. If you want to survive, you need to make a choice. We can either give them what they want, our lives, and walk away. Or we can fight and expose everything. But if we do that, we may never walk out of here alive. The weight of her words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had never imagined this would be the price of justice. Not like this. The lives of those he cared about, the future of the case, the power of exposing the truth, they were all on the line. But what was he willing to sacrifice? He could give in. He could hand over the folder and walk away with his life intact, maybe even protect Harper in the process. But what kind of man would he be? What kind of justice would he have left if he chose to save himself and let those responsible for this corruption go free? The thought sickened him. Or he could fight. He could use the evidence, expose the system for what it was, and take down Mitchell, even if it meant his own death. The stakes had never been higher. But that choice came with its own price. If he didn't make it out of this warehouse, everything he had fought for, everything, would be gone. You don't have to do this. Harper's voice was a whisper now, barely audible over the sound of their captors moving closer. You don't have to be a martyr. Marcus's gaze flickered from Harper's pleading eyes to the masked figures that surrounded them. He could see the darkness in their eyes. These were men who had no regard for life, for justice, for anything except power. They were part of a system that crushed anyone who dared to challenge it. But Marcus had already made his decision. He couldn't back down now. You're wrong, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. This isn't about being a martyr. This is about doing what's right. The figure in front of them tilted his head, as if curious. You think you can stop us? Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he held up the folder. This evidence, it will destroy everything you've built. If you kill me, it doesn't matter. This information will get out. The world will know who you are." The figure's eyes flickered toward his companions, and for the briefest moment, there was hesitation. But only for a moment. "Don't be foolish," the figure sneered. "You're nothing but a small cog in a machine much larger than you. The truth will be buried, just like all the others. You think anyone cares about a dead man's testimony?" Harper's eyes flashed with defiance. "You're wrong. This isn't over. Not yet." Marcus felt a surge of determination coursing through him. This was it, the ultimate choice. He could give up the folder, walk away, and live to fight another day. Or he could risk everything, stand up to the system, and die with the truth in his hands. The question was no longer about survival. It was about legacy. What kind of legacy did he want to leave behind? Would he choose to live with the knowledge that he had let the powerful escape? Or would he choose to stand tall and fight for justice, even if it meant his own death? He looked at Harper, her face now a mix of fear and hope. She was waiting for him to make the decision, to be the one who decided if they lived or died. Marcus knew, deep in his soul, what he had to do. "We fight," Marcus said, his voice steady, his resolve unshakable. "We take them down." And with that, the battle for justice began. The tension in the air thickened as Marcus and Harper prepared for what was to come. The warehouse, once a place of quiet secrecy, now seemed to pulse with the weight of their decisions. The masked figures closed in, their movements precise and deliberate, as if they had rehearsed this moment for years. But Marcus wasn't going to let fear consume him. Not now. Not after everything he had sacrificed to get to this point. Harper stood beside him, her breathing steady despite the chaos around them. "Do you have a plan?" she whispered, barely audible above the sound of footsteps echoing off the cold concrete floors. "No," Marcus replied, his gaze fixed on the men closing in on them. "But I know what's at stake." The figure who had spoken earlier, tall, imposing, with a voice like gravel, took a step forward. "You still think you can change anything?" he asked, his words dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a pawn. A useless pawn." Marcus clenched his fists around the folder, feeling its weight like a hammer in his hand. "Maybe, but even a pawn can take down a king." The figure's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." Before Marcus could respond, the room exploded into action. One of the masked figures lunged forward, grabbing Harper by the arm and pulling her toward the center of the room. She struggled, but the figure's grip was unrelenting. "Let her go," Marcus shouted, moving forward, but another figure blocked his path, drawing a weapon, a cold, steel barrel glinting under the dim light. Everything happened in a blur. Marcus's heart raced as he searched for a way to stop this, any way to get the upper hand. But his mind was racing faster than his body could move. The figure with the weapon stepped closer, the gun aimed directly at his chest. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Marcus could feel the cold chill of impending doom. But just as the figure was about to fire, a loud crash echoed from the side of the warehouse. Harper's voice rang out, filled with terror and anger. "No, Marcus, look out." Without thinking, Marcus dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet that whizzed past him, the sound of the gunshot ringing in his ears. A scream followed, Harper's scream. The figure holding her had thrown her to the ground, knocking the breath out of her. She gasped for air, her eyes wide with fear, but Marcus's focus was razor-sharp. In that moment, something inside him snapped. There was no more time for hesitation. No more room for doubt. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It wasn't about taking down Mitchell or the corrupt system. It was about survival. Marcus surged forward, using his shoulder to slam into the figure holding the weapon. The man stumbled back, losing his balance just long enough for Marcus to knock the gun out of his hand. It clattered across the floor, useless now. But the fight was far from over. The other figures closed in, their weapons drawn, but Marcus wasn't afraid. He was on autopilot now, a man driven by desperation and fury. He grabbed a metal pipe lying on the floor, swinging it with all his might at the closest figure. The pipe connected with a sickening thud, sending the man sprawling to the ground. He didn't move. Harper was up now, her face bruised but determined. She rushed toward Marcus, her eyes locked on the remaining figures. "We need to move. Now," she shouted, her voice sharp, commanding. But Marcus couldn't leave, not yet. He couldn't leave the truth behind. He couldn't let them walk away, thinking they had won. Not after everything they had done. The final figure, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward, eyes burning with fury. You're making a mistake. This is bigger than you. You can't win. Marcus lifted the folder, his hand trembling as he held it high. I'm not trying to win, he said, his voice steady. I'm trying to make sure you lose. With one swift motion, he tossed the folder across the room toward the exit. Harper's eyes widened in realization. Marcus, no. But it was too late. The folder sailed through the air, landing just outside the warehouse doors, in the hands of the only person who could expose the corruption, the informant who had been waiting for this moment. The figure's eyes widened in disbelief. No, you didn't. Marcus turned to Harper, his eyes fierce. We don't need to fight anymore. The truth is out. Before the figure could respond, the sound of sirens blared in the distance. Louder, closer, and unmistakable. The cavalry was coming. As the remaining figures turned, confused and desperate, the doors of the warehouse flew open. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the room. The police had arrived. The men who had terrorized Marcus and Harper were no longer in control. The evidence was now in the hands of those who could stop them. But even as the police stormed in, guns drawn, Marcus's eyes didn't leave the figure in front of him. There was no fear left in his heart, only the rush of victory, the kind of victory that could only come when you refused to back down, even when the odds seemed impossible. Your time is up, Marcus said, his voice low but unyielding. You've lost. The figure lunged one final time, but the police were faster. The room exploded into chaos as the masked men were restrained and cuffed, their weapons useless now. But Marcus didn't need to see them taken away. He had won. The truth had already been exposed, and justice was finally within reach. As the sound of handcuffs clicking echoed through the warehouse, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of peace. But his mind was already on the future. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But this was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change everything. For once, Marcus could breathe. The weight of the past few hours began to lift as Marcus stepped out of the warehouse into the bright light of dawn. The air felt different, cleaner, as if the world itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of the storm. The police had finished their work, the remaining figures taken into custody, their fate now in the hands of the justice system. But it wasn't over, not for Marcus. Harper stood beside him, her face bruised but triumphant, her eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and relief. For so long, they had been running from shadows, caught in a web of lies and corruption. But now, they had brought the truth to light. And nothing, no one, could take that away. Do you think they'll really pay for what they did? Harper asked, her voice soft, almost uncertain. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. They'll have to. The evidence is undeniable. It's not just about us anymore. This is bigger than our fight. This is about holding them accountable. He could see the faint glow of the sunrise behind her, the golden light reflecting off the police cars parked outside, their sirens now silent. The whole world had shifted in the span of a few hours. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to believe that change was possible. But his thoughts weren't on the men behind bars or the corrupt system that had finally been exposed. His thoughts were on something deeper, something he had fought for, not just because it was right, but because he had no other choice. The journey that had brought him here, the sacrifices he had made, had all been in service of a single, unwavering belief: justice. Justice wasn't always immediate, Marcus knew. It wasn't always swift, but it was inevitable. It had a way of catching up with those who tried to outrun it. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the weight of his own resilience. He had been knocked down, betrayed, and pushed to the edge of despair. But he had never given up. Not once. And now, as he stood on the other side of this battle, he understood something he hadn't before. Justice didn't come from the courts, the law, or the system. It came from within. What happens now? Harper asked, her voice breaking the silence. Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady and calm. We live. We move forward. And we make sure this never happens again. The road ahead was uncertain, but it no longer scared him. The lessons he had learned along the way, about strength, truth, and sacrifice, had forged him into someone who could never be broken again. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this fight months ago, filled with doubt and anger. He was stronger now, not because he had won, but because he had survived. And that was enough. Harper smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting despite the bruises that still marked her skin. You know, I thought this day would never come. But here we are. Marcus nodded, his eyes drifting to the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise higher, casting a warm glow over the world around them. Here we are. As they walked toward the waiting police officers, the weight of the past seemed to slip away. The officers greeted them with quiet respect, acknowledging their role in bringing down the corrupt figures who had ruled their lives for so long. Marcus could feel the eyes of the officers on him, but it wasn't judgment he saw. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that came when someone had fought for what was right and emerged victorious. The journey had taken everything from him, his peace, his stability, his faith in the system. But it had given him something far more valuable in return. The knowledge that even in a world full of corruption, truth could still prevail. The knowledge that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found if you dared to search for it. As the police cars drove away, the sun now fully risen and the sky painted in hues of gold and pink, Marcus and Harper stood together, side by side. They had fought their fight, and they had won. But their journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hope. True hope.